8 S.T.A.R.S. officers died in 1998. Their names were erased to bury Umbrella's failures. The Spencer Mansion gates yawn open, a buried Victorian Gothic labyrinth. A distorted broadcast echoes, * abnormal activity reported, * but the true horror festered in its walls. Broadcast echoes Umbrella's researchers worked their failures, activity not as reported martyrs, but as architects of a catastrophe they could not contain. What price does a company demand of those who build its sins? The stone remembers. What happened to the scientists at Spencer Mansion? Their stories were wiped to protect Umbrella's secrets. The Spencer Mansion incident of July 1998 was no accident. Records vanished, names were ground to dust. These researchers did not merely stumble into horror, they built its engine. The T-virus was their design, their burden, their unmarked grave. No obituaries, no tributes. Only silence polished as Umbrella's corporate ledgers. Why erase the dead? Because their existence proved the truth. Monsters are not born in vials. They are forged in laboratories of complicity. The stone remembers, the company forgets. The Spencer Mansion stood as a monument to sterile ambition. Its marble halls echoed with the hum of cryogenic freezers. Its stained glass windows filtered light into sterile laboratories. Before the rot became visible, this was where Oswell E. Spencer wove his tapestry of control, a man whose mind mapped bioterrorism as others map empires. The T-virus, coiled in test tubes long before Raccoon City's ashes, was here refined. Glass vials lined refrigerated walls like tombstones for unborn horrors. Researchers in lab coats moved like shadows, their faces masked not by duty but by fear. They knew the virus' potential, they knew its failures. They knew the bodies buried in the mansion's basement, subjects who had learned too much. Their silence was not accidental, it was engineered. Every breakthrough was a ledger entry, every death a footnote deleted by Spencer's red pen. The mansion's grandeur was a lie etched in Concretate's ballroom, once hosted executives who praised progress while the sub-basement cooked nightmares. The T-virus had parents, the failed G-virus, the abandoned progenitor projects. Each failure fed the next, a cycle of erasure. The researchers. They were cogs, not villains. Their names vanished not because they were saved, but because they were spent. When the outbreak shattered the doors, the world saw monsters. But the true horror was the quiet beforeth calculated breath held by a company that turned scientists into specters. The stone remembers, the company forgets. And the mansion, now a grave, still hums with the whispers of those who built hell and never once looked back. What happened to the scientists at Spencer Mansion? They did not merely follow orders, they engineered nightmares. Umbrella's hunger for dominance turned the estate into a forge. T-virus, mutants, failures buried in concrete. Spencer's vision was not progress. It was annihilation dressed as innovation. Researchers signed their souls to his ledger. Wesker, his shadow, did not blink as test subjects became statistics. Their names scrapped with the lab reports. No memorial marks their desks. No records trace their choices. Umbrella's architects of horror left no witnesses. They rationalized the agony, they calculated the death tolls, they knew the cost, they just refused to pay it. The mansion's walls remember equations scribbled in blood, blueprints for plagues, protocols for purging humanity. Spencer's family was a chain of command. Loyalty bought with lies, betrayal masked as purpose. When the experiment spiraled, the researchers were discarded. Their silence was Umbrella's shield. History does not credit them, it condemns them. Complicit in a symphony of suffering, they became its unspoken chorus. The T-virus was their legacy. A toxin brewed in test tubes and moral rot. What price did they demand for their god complex? None. They believed hell was a product to perfect, and so the world forgets, the company forgets. Only the mansion's stones whisper their crime, not victims. Not heroes, architects of a silent war, erased to let the war begin. The labs beneath Spencer Mansion first exhaled their rot. Hollow-eyed test subjects bled black in veins, flesh twisted, then hardened half man, half monster. A virus brewed in glass vials, its name etched in fear. T-virus, not an accident, a beginning they knew. The researchers who mixed serums, who adjusted parameters, who watched infected cells devour healthy ones, their hands stained with failure, their notes filled with revisions. No alarms raised, no doors locked, only the quiet calculus of progress. The T-virus was a seed, G-virus its root. The lineage of horror grew in their equations. They documented, they refined, they erased failed trials but never the truth. Their names were scrubbed not to hide victims but to bury architects. What did the stones whisper? Not confession, design. The first screams were not warnings, they were blueprints. The war began in ink and infection, in hollow eyes, in twisted flesh. In the silence of those who built the storm, the company forgets, the stones remember. The stones of Spencer Mansion hold a sound no living tongue can speak, a breath of rusted air. A whisper of lab coats in the dark. July 1998, the T-virus, coiled in glass vials and buried in the earth, chose its moment. Not all who worked in the sublevel labs fled. Some stayed, not as martyrs, as midwives to a nightmare they believed they could control. The breach began with a lock disengaging, then another, a ventilation shaft groaning. The Bravo team's boots echoed through the corridors until the echoes answered back. Not in kind, in kindred, their radios crackled with screams, then static. The garden, once a place of ivy and roses, became a graveyard of broken limbs and gnashing teeth. The researchers, their hands stained with the same virus they'd injected into test subjects, watched from shattered windows. Some wept, some filmed, none intervened. Umbrella's cleanup began before the last body hit the floor. Blueprints were burned, digital logs dissolved. The names of those who'd designed the Outbreak, engineers, virologists, the ones who'd fed the virus human DNA aura, carved from records, not for mercy, for erasure. The mansion's overgrown paths now hide more than roots, they hide choices. The Bravo team's reports, when recovered, named no culprits. Only a void where accountability should have been. What does a corporation do when its experiment becomes its master? It buries the bones. It lets the forest reclaim the walls. It shifts the blame to monsters, not men. The Raccoon City disaster, 2 years later, was no accident. It was a mirror, a reflection of the same hubris, the same silence. The stones remember, the soil remembers. The air tastes of iron and regret. The dead do not whisper, they roar, but only if you dare to listen. The roar is a requiem for those who built the monster they feared. These researchers were not passive victims. They were silent architects of a nightmare, their hands stained with formulas that turned flesh into futility. Their names were not lost, they were taken. Paper trails dissolved, hard drives flared, then black. Umbrellas lie machine ground forward, not just burying data, but the very memory of complicity. As Raccoon City burned, the corporation's reach extended. Every lab report, every witness, every corpse became a brick in the wall of silence. The mansion's shadows held their secrets, but the streets held their sins. Who decides which stories survive? Who erases the architects to spare the world the truth? The dead still roar. But the living have learned to swallow their names. 247 words. The U.S. military's incineration of Raccoon City in October 1998 did not end the nightmare. It buried a corpse while the disease metastasized elsewhere. The researchers who perished in that mansion were not mere casualties. Their hands had mixed the elixirs, calibrated the vectors, and signed the manifests. Umbrella's erasure of their identities was not an act of mercy. It was a ledger burn, what remains of them. Ghosts in lab reports redacted to oblivion, names replaced with serial numbers, faces dissolved into security footage static. They were not martyrs. They were midwives to monstrosity. Their compliance was not coerced, it was cultivated. Training programs, loyalty oaths, the slow drip of moral decay. By 1998, they had already chosen their legacy. The outbreak that followed proved it. Raccoon City's collapse was not a mistake. It was a calculated purge. Umbrella's bioweapon ambitions never ceased. They merely traded laboratories for war zones. From 1998 to 2026, the corporation's shadow stretched across continents, its sins buried under new lies. The erased researchers became collateral in a war they had helped design. Why preserve their anonymity? Because their existence proved the truth. Evil is not born in boardrooms. It is recruited, trained, rewarded. The dead of Spencer Mansion are nameless not because they were innocent, but because they were ordinary. And ordinary people, given the right incentives, become the scaffolding of hell. The military's firestorm cleansed the city. Umbrella's archives cleansed the record. The living swallowed their names as they had swallowed every warning. the dead still roar, but who now listens? 291 words. The walls of Spencer Mansion still breathe with the ink of erased names. Not ghosts, but signature scientists who drafted protocols, calibrated vials, and sealed their own silences. Their hands did not tremble when they signed the T-virus accords. They knew what the vials held, they knew what the vats would birth. The air there tastes of ozone and rot, a scent that clings to lab coats long after the experiment's end. Umbrella did not kill them for defiance. It killed them for knowing too much how the dead could be made to serve, how fear could be distilled into a serum. Survival is not a victory here, it is a wound that never crusted. The few who fled carried more than trauma, they carried data drives hidden in false teeth, equations scribbled on skin. But memory is a fickle vault. Years later they forget which horrors they witnessed, the screams in the ventilation shafts, the way the mansion's floorboards pulsed at dawn, or the face of the colleague who became a test subject. Silence is Umbrella's true bioweapon. It does not decay, it replicates. What does a corporation fear more than failure? Exposure. The researchers were not erased to hide their deaths. They were erased to bury the proof that complicity is contagious. Every lab report burned, every name scrubbed from payroll records these are not mourning rituals. They are inoculations against truth. The mansion's shadows stretch beyond its walls. They coil in boardrooms, whisper in stock prices. The survivors who remain do not speak. They have learned that survival horror is not the monsters in the dark. It is the dark itself, polished and sold as a clean slate. And in that polished void, Umbrella waits. The walls of Spencer Mansion still whisper, not in screams, but in the hum of lab equipment buried beneath Raccoon City's ashes. The T-virus did not die when the doors sealed. It slithered into glass vials, into Harvard's lecture halls, into the marrow of Umbrella's new wars. By 1998, G-virus had already learned to twist. The researchers who mixed serums under antiseptic stench knew this. They saw the same hunger in their tests, subject human, and otherwise that Spencer himself had fed. Their names were erased not because they were innocent, but because their hands were too stained to let history judge. Paper trails dissolved. Lab logs cited protocol breaches, not the things that crawled through air ducts at night. By 2026, the pattern had refined, no more mansions. Now bioweapons bloom in neon-lit skyscrapers, in the lungs of soldiers who think they are breathing armor. The same virus that turned a girl into a monster now flows through Roman IV drips in sterile clinics. What is a cure if not a mirror? The dark does not end, it only trades coats and those who stitch the seams. They are not new, they are echoes, the same ones who once whispered, just one more trial, as the door locked. The walls of Spencer Mansion still breathe with the ink of erased names. Not ghosts, but signature scientists who drafted protocols, calibrated vials, and sealed their own silences. Their hands did not tremble when they signed the T-virus accords. They knew what the vials held, they knew what the vats would birth. The air there tastes of ozone and rot, a scent that clings to lab coats long after the experiment's end. Umbrella did not kill them for defiance. It killed them for knowing too much how the dead could be made to serve, how fear could be distilled into a serum. Survival is not a victory here, it is a wound that never crusted. The few who fled carried more than trauma, they carried data drives hidden in false teeth, equations scribbled on skin. But memory is a fickle vault. Years later they forget which horrors they witnessed, the screams in the ventilation shafts, the way the mansion's floorboards pulsed at dawn, or the face of the colleague who became a test subject. Silence is Umbrella's true bioweapon. It does not decay, it replicates. What does a corporation fear more than failure? Exposure. The researchers were not erased to hide their deaths. They were erased to bury the proof that complicity is contagious. Every lab report burned, every name scrubbed from payroll records these are not mourning rituals. They are inoculations against truth. The mansion's shadows stretch beyond its walls. They coil in boardrooms, whisper in stock prices. The survivors who remain do not speak. They have learned that survival horror is not the monsters in the dark. It is the dark itself, polished and sold as a clean slate. And in that polished void, Umbrella waits. The heartbeat you hear, not a survivor, not a ghost. It is the pulse of an experiment left to rot. The researchers at Spencer Mansion were not bystanders. They were gears in a machine that chewed through ethics. Their names were erased, but their work. It seeped into the soil. The 1998 outbreak in Raccoon